There's this really great effect you can get in woodworking when you take a dark wood and a light wood and you bring them together in a dovetail joint. It just kind of pops and it kind of makes the joint look amazing. And I didn't have any maple or walnut or any of those kind of woods you would normally use, so I asked myself the question, could I imitate that look using some 2x4s and some wood stain? And today we're going to find out the answer to that question. Now, the wood I use for this project is the most basic wood you can get your hands on. These are just 2x4s, and as you can see from some of the footage, some of these 2x4s were really rough. There's not much to them, but the nice thing is if you're willing to put in the work and clean them up nicely, you'll get a good result. So when I'm planing the edges here, part of that is to kind of get to that nice wood, but more importantly, it's to help the glue up. When you're gluing two surfaces together, you want to make sure they're as flat as possible and as straight as possible so that they have as much contact area as they can. Taking that hand plane to this really helps with that, so that when you later on go to spread the glue can kind of work in all those surfaces so you get a really tight fit. I already had the top for this before I began this project, but I still needed the two sides that would make up the main construction for this. And so for these, I took 3 2x4s and I glued them together. And to make things go even faster, and rather than doing 2 separate glue ups, I actually just glued them all up at the same time, laying them all out in the clamps, making sure not to glue in the middle. And you'll notice there's 2 other boards on the side that kind of go the width of this as well. Those are hardwood. And basically what I've noticed is when you clamp up 2x4s are so soft. It doesn't take much, even a finger can really dent it. And so if you take clamps and you just start wrenching on these clamps and the wood starts compressing, what ends up happening is you have these little indentations from where the clamps were really pressing on the wood. When you put those other boards in place there, those kind of sacrificial boards, those hardwood, it kind of spreads out the pressure so that you don't have those indentations in the wood that you have to deal with later. It just kind of helps out in that process. Now this next part was my favorite once I got the wood out of the clamps. I just love taking a hand plane across wood that doesn't look good, and after a while you start to see some real cool wood pop out of it. Now I'll say this, when you're working with 2x4s or any kind of soft wood, it's always better when you don't have very many knots in the wood. The knots in them can be very, very hard, and those can really do a number on your hand plane. So I just suggest if you're gonna do stuff with 2x4s, if you can find large sections without knots that you can work with, it's gonna make your life so much easier. Here I only had a few knots to deal with, kind of some on the sides, and it wasn't the end of the world, but it would have been a lot nicer if there were none at all. And now the goal is, of course, to take these 2 legs that I've just made and to dovetail them into this top piece in a really nice way. There's not really a right or wrong in terms of how many tails you do and how far apart they're spaced. I know some people really like the look of these really small pins and these larger tails. I just kind of do what looks best to me, but there's really different ways that you can do it. And so as you can see, I'm just cutting the tails. This is always what I start with first. After I cut the tails and remove all the different material, and you can see other videos I've done to kind of talk about how that process takes place. Once I do that though, it's a matter of marking those tails onto the top of the table so that I can remove that material. I felt like I had to be a lot more exact in terms of cutting and doing all those things because the wood I was working with was already stained. Again, I've removed the material within those pin recesses. With pine, especially with softwood like pine, it doesn't take too long, and if you have a nice sharp chisel, it's gonna be really nice work. That being said, if you don't have a nice sharp chisel, it's gonna be really, really frustrating, and I don't recommend it. Once I removed all that material, was making sure that the side fit into the top of the table, taking it in, taking it out, making sure that I'm just working away slowly. And you can see here I'm kind of fitting that in place. And I got so excited that this fit in place finally. It took a lot of work that I decided, wow, I should just throw some glue in there. I should just kind of put this together. That's going to be awesome. Which was a big mistake, because as soon as I did that, I realized this was going to make everything else I did just so frustrating from this point on. Now, instead of being able to work freely with this top piece, it was always attached to the side. It was a lot more difficult to kind of navigate this. I had to kind of step over it and saw at an angle, and it just made clamping things more difficult. So just think ahead when you're doing stuff like this. I would recommend just making sure you have a plan before you glue up. Don't just get excited and start throwing things together. I learned from my mistake though, and we moved on from there. At this point, the process was pretty much the same for the other side, except it was a little bit more awkward. Basically tracing the tails onto that same top piece, removing the material with saws first and then with chisels afterwards. And then it was again fitting that piece in, but this time not gluing it because I wanted to make sure I had a cross brace that would go between just to hold everything as square as as possible. And so for this, again, it's just a 2x4. I cut it to rough length. I ripped it down to a kind of a thickness that I wanted. I made sure that the brace matched the distance of the shoulder lines of the dovetail on the top, just to make sure everything would be held tightly in place. And for this, I just did a mortise and tenon joint. I didn't go too deep with the mortise. I didn't want to go all the way through and just have to worry about that. So I just kind of mortised out these two different little sections, made a tenon that would match that, and then I was ready to bring everything together. And at this point, I got it on its side on the table, made sure everything was ready to go. I did a test fit first, and then it was just a matter of getting some glue on there, putting the leg on top. Because the wood expands when you have glue on it, it was a little bit harder to get this fitted, so I took my trusty mallet and I just started whacking this in place. You never want to just take a mallet straight to it because you'll just get these huge dents. If you take a piece of wood and put that over, it's going to just dissipate the impact so that you can not damage your work. And so that's always going to be recommended. Got this together, stood it up straight, and then got the clamps on it. Now at this point, this is where things got interesting, because normally when you finish a dovetail, you kind of bring it down and you kind of look at it, and there's maybe some high spots or some low spots, and you really want to kind of flush it off so that everything's nice and even. The problem was, though, that the top of this thing had already been stained and finished. And so I was trying to figure out, how can I make this dovetail look nice without wrecking the coat of stain that was already on there? And my conclusion was, I really couldn't. Basically, my solution was to just plane it down anyways, even though I was losing some of that stain. You can see the wood gets a lot lighter as I do this, but I could come back later on with some tape and some stain and try my best to kind of just paint in those areas, remove the tape, and then with sandpaper later, just kind of finesse any of those areas that had some extra stain on them. Well, after I took some sandpaper to it, wiped it all down, made sure it was all looking okay, I took some polyurethane and just kind of wiped that on there to give it a finish. And at this point, I'm ready to bring it into the house. I'm looking forward to having this just as a place to hold my coffee, as a place to rest my book when I'm reading, and just a nice addition to the house. Now, one of the things I recognized when I brought this in the house is that we have a lot of different things made out of wood. This is my fault, and some of them match one another, some of them don't match each other. And so we're gonna see where this one ends up, if it stays where it is, or it goes somewhere else where it can match the decor a little bit better. But regardless of where this ends up, I'm happy with how it turned out. I thought it was neat to try to mix these two different kinds of wood that were actually the same kind of wood. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, hit the thumbs up. If you want to subscribe, that always helps as well. Until next time, take care.